Snow blew sideways across the cottonwoods, sanding the hills silent. Clara kept walking. Soot stiffened the hem of her dress. The split seams of her boots let the cold in bite by bite. She didn't flinch. You stop for pain when you expect rescue. She expected none. She'd already passed wagons that didn't slow and porches that shuddered at the sight of her. The wind found every gap in her shawl and like memory started soft and then turned cruel. Still, she tracked a horizon that wasn't there, just one more fence, one more bend, one more breath that didn't taste of smoke. She was a widow with no land, no child, and worst of all, no place where her name sounded welcome. Ash clung to her skirts as if the burned house insisted on coming along. Ahead, the town crouched under a sky roof, smoking streets bare. Clara tightened the shawl around her shoulders and stepped forward. If there was kindness left in the world, it would have to meet her halfway. The town waited beneath the weight of evening, its silence sharper than the wind. The last bell for prayer tolled across the roofs, not like an invitation, but like a warning outsiders turned back. The sign above the general store swung loose on its hinges, groaning with each gust. Smoke rose from chimneys, proof of warmth inside, yet not a single figure lingered on the street. Every shutter was drawn, every doorway, tight against the cold and against her. Clara felt it in the way the empty windows seemed to watch. This was not a place that welcomed late arrivals. Here even hope froze before it reached the porch. Clara pushed open the door of the general store, and warmth rushed over her like a shock. The air smelled of flour, cinnamon, and old wood, the pot-belly stove in the corner glowing with steady fire. For a fleeting moment, it felt like shelter. Behind the counter, Mrs. Tibbet counted matches into a tin, her eyes fixed downward, her manner as cold as the snow outside. Clara cleared her throat, voice low but steady. "Ma'am, I'm not here to beg. I can sweep, fold cloth, anything you might need." The words hung in the air, fragile against the silence. The warmth of the room could not soften the chill in the woman's gaze. Mrs. Tibbet finally looked up, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. "I remember you," she said flatly. "Jameson's wife from the ridge near Stony Ford." Clara's chin dipped once in acknowledgement. The woman's words cut deeper than the cold outside. "Burned down, didn't it? Heard you lost everything, even the baby." The sentence fell heavy, cruel in its casualness. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Mrs. Tibbet shrugged as if dismissing a broken fence post. "God sends his fire where he pleases." Her tone carried no pity, only judgment, as though Clara's losses were divine punishment rather than tragedy. The warmth of the store turned stifling. Clara drew her shawl tighter, the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke suddenly sour. She had asked for work, not charity, yet the door of kindness had closed before it was even cracked. With quiet resolve, she turned back toward the cold. The click of the shutting door behind her, sharper than any slap. Out in the street again, the wind howled, but at least its cruelty was honest. Clara's boots scraped against uneven stones as she climbed the steps of the church. The wind pressed hard, pulling at her shawl, biting into her numb fingers. She reached for the heavy door, but it was locked solid, unyielding. She leaned against the railing, arms wrapped tight around herself, the cold seeping deeper than bone. Above her, the bell tower loomed, casting a long, merciless shadow across the snow. Once she might have wept or prayed. Now her eyes were dry, her faith as frozen as the ground beneath her. Alone, she let the winter take what little it wished. From the edge of the square came the soft patter of bare feet across snow. Clara turned and saw them, two small girls, twins, no older than 6, hair-tangled coats too thin for the season. One clutched a wooden button like treasure, the other held a string with a broken locket swinging against her chest. Their eyes were wide, curious, unafraid. They stared at Clara as though she were both stranger and story. The bolder one tugged her sister closer. "You look like someone without a porch," she said plainly. Clara managed a faint reply. "No, I don't have one." The quieter twin reached forward, brushing the hem of Clara's soot-stained dress. Her fingers came back black. "What's that?" she whispered. Clara swallowed. "Ash. From a fire." "Was it yours?" the louder girl asked, her voice sharp in the hush of falling snow. Clara's mouth opened, then closed. At last she nodded. "Yes." And in that moment the children did not recoil or judge. One simply stepped forward and wrapped small arms around Clara's waist, holding her like she belonged. The louder of the twins tilted her head, studying Clara with a gravity far beyond her years. "You want a home, don't you?" she asked as if it were the simplest question in the world. The words struck Clara harder than the winter wind. A home, something she had not dared to imagine since the fire had consumed her past. Slowly her voice trembled out the truth. "I just want a place to be still." The girl nodded solemnly as if this confession made perfect sense. "We don't have a mama," she declared, "but our pa needs a bride. We've been waiting to find one." Clara blinked, stunned. Was this a child's game or some cruel trick? Yet the earnestness in their eyes left no room for mockery. The quieter twin squeezed Clara's hand, her little fingers surprisingly strong. "You look like someone who needs someone," she whispered. Clara's knees nearly gave way, not from the cold, but from the strange, piercing weight of that sentence. Need was a word she had buried long ago, tucked away beneath ash and silence. Now these children spoke it aloud as if it were holy. Between the locked church doors and the bitter streets, their invitation rang like grace. Against all reason, Clara felt herself pulled toward them, not by duty, not by bargain, but by the fragile hope that perhaps they were right. Clara glanced once more at the church doors, still locked, still cold, offering nothing but silence. Then she looked back at the twins, their bare feet pressing into the snow, as if winter had no claim on them. They were not shivering, not afraid, only waiting with a patience that felt older than their years. One girl tugged her hand, gently urging her forward. Clara hesitated, then let herself be led. Faith had turned its key against her. But these children, fragile yet fearless, opened a different kind of door, one that asked nothing except that she walk beside them. The children led Clara down a winding lane lined with snow-laden cottonwoods until a weathered house came into view. Its porch sagged, the barn leaned precariously, yet smoke curled from the chimney like a promise of warmth. A rocking chair swayed lightly in the wind, as if someone had just risen from it, leaving behind the echo of a life still lived. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stew and wood smoke. A sturdy table bore the rounded edges of years of use, while shelves displayed hand-carved animals, rough but tender shapes born from patient hands. For Clara, the cabin was not merely shelter. It carried the residue of care, of meals shared, of laughter that once filled its corners. Compared to the cold dismissal of the church and the store, this space felt astonishingly alive, fragile, yet enduring. It was not grandeur she stepped into, but something rarer, an ember of belonging, waiting to be stirred. From the far corner of the room, a man rose slowly from a bench. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, hands marked with the work of a life lived outdoors. A scar split his left brow, lending his face a quiet gravity rather than menace. His eyes met Clara's and held there, not probing, not hostile, simply still. He didn't offer words, only the faintest tilt of his head, a gesture that was neither greeting nor rejection, but something steadier, acknowledgement. In that silence, Clara sensed he was a man defined less by speech than by labor, someone who let his work and presence speak for him. It was not warmth yet, but it was not cruelty either, and that was enough. Thomas didn't press her with questions, nor did he probe at wounds already raw. Instead, he simply gestured toward the chair by the fire. Clara moved slowly, uncertain, but the moment she sat, the warmth seeped into her bones like something sacred. Her fingers tingled back to life. Her eyes burned not from smoke, but from the sudden ache of kindness. Without a word, Thomas set a bowl of stew before her and stepped away. Later, when Clara rose to leave, he stood at the door, not blocking it with force, but with presence alone. His voice was rough, steady. "You got somewhere better?" She shook her head. "No," he nodded once. "Then stay until you do." No conditions, no demands, no claim on who she had been or what she had lost. Just space, just permission to exist without judgment. In that silence, she realized what he offered was more than food or fire. It was dignity. Thomas stepped aside, his hand lifting just enough to point toward a small door near the hearth. Clara hesitated, her heart pounding, as though even kindness might be a trap. But when she opened the door, what she found was no snare, only a modest room, quiet and waiting. A cot stood neatly against the wall, its single blanket folded square edges, sharp as if placed there with care. Beside it, a pitcher of water still held a hint of warmth, proof that someone had thought ahead, that someone expected her to rest. She stood in the threshold, almost undone by the simple order of it. No grandeur, no excess, just the signs of a household where thoughtfulness was woven into the smallest details. She didn't lie down right away. Instead, she lingered, listening to the murmur of the rocking chair outside, the faint scrape of a blade against wood, and the soft breaths of the girls curled in their own sleep. The world that had been nothing but ashes and silence now breathed around her, steady and alive. Clara slipped inside and sat on the cot, realizing she was, for the first time in a long while, somewhere she wasn't merely tolerated, she was considered. The first light of dawn spilled thin and golden across the cabin floor as Clara stepped quietly from her room. The air was cool, touched with the faint smoke of an early fire. On the porch, her boots rested by the door, clean polished and stitched where the leather had split. Someone had cared enough to mend what she had long accepted as broken. Thomas appeared from the yard's shoulders, broad beneath his coat, carrying the weight of wood with ease. He set the load down, leaned against the post, and studied her with the calm of a man who measured words before speaking. "Do you know how to make bread?" he asked simply. Clara blinked, startled by the gentleness behind the question. "I did once," she replied. He nodded. "Then perhaps you could teach the girls if you're staying." The invitation wasn't a command nor a plea. It was the opening of a door she hadn't expected, a place, not just to warm herself, but to pass something on. Clara's gaze shifted to her mended boots, then to the man before her. For the first time, the idea of belonging no longer felt like a dream too far. Morning stretched pale across the yard, the kind of light that softened edges without warming the air. Clara sat on the porch rail, still unsure if she belonged, when the question slipped from her lips almost without thought. "What's your name?" The man paused mid-step, an axe balanced easily in his hand. His scar caught the light, and for a moment she thought he might not answer. Then simply he said, "Thomas." Nothing more. No flourish, no demand for hers. Just a name given like a steady beam of wood, plain, but strong enough to carry weight. Before she could speak again, June and Josie came tumbling forward, their small hands wrapped around a carving of uneven wood. "We made you a dog," June announced proudly. "It doesn't bark, but it stays." Clara knelt, fingers trembling as she accepted the gift. The crude little shape sat solid in her palm, rough yet loyal. Something in her chest eased. A name, a token, and a place where even silence seemed to hold meaning. These were not small things. For the first time in years, Clara felt the faint outline of belonging sketch itself into her story. The next morning broke clear, but sharp sunlight slicing through the frost-glazed window panes. Clara stirred awake to the low groan of timbers settling and the faint hiss of a kettle on the stove. When she stepped into the main room, Thomas was already there. He moved with the quiet certainty of a man used to labor without applause. A dented tin cup clinked against the table as he set it down for her coffee, black and bitter steam curling into the cold. He offered no words beyond a single nod before pulling on his coat and hat. Then, with axe in hand, he slipped out into the morning, the door closing behind him like a promise to return. Clara lingered, the warmth of the cup seeping into her fingers. Soon the twins patted in hair tangled and faces soft with sleep. They climbed onto the benches, watching her with open trust that made her chest ache. June held out a comb, her small voice almost apologetic. "Papa's braids hurt." Clara smiled faintly and settled behind them, drawing the teeth gently through their knots. She began to hum nonsense stories as her hands worked tales that seemed to rise unbidden from some forgotten part of herself. The girls giggled, leaning into her touch, finding safety where the world outside had given them none. By the time Thomas's axe began to strike steady rhythms outside, Clara had woven 2 neat braids. Josie tucked herself against her lap, and Clara realized this quiet routine. The fire, the coffee, the simple task was already shaping itself into something rare. Not mere survival, but the outline of a life. That evening carried the same stillness as the nights before. Yet Clara sensed something had shifted. She had spent the day sweeping ash from the hearth, reheating stew and folding linens, until her hands felt useful again. When she placed her boots by the fire, cracked and stiff from the road, she thought little of them. But by morning they had been oiled, their seams stitched with careful thread. No word had been spoken, no explanation offered, but the message was as clear as any promise. Someone had taken time to mend what she thought beyond repair. Later, as the girls laughed over their supper, Clara felt a weight in the doorway. She didn't turn, but she knew Thomas was there. He stood only a moment, just long enough for her to feel the steadiness of his watching. It wasn't intrusive, not the hungry gaze of men she had known before, but something quieter, an acknowledgement, a kind of keeping. When she finally glanced up, their eyes caught, and he looked away first, disappearing back into the cold. He had not asked her to stay. He had not spoken the words. Yet every small act, the oiled boots, the space made at the table, the rhythm of work he left room for her to join, spoke of an invitation more genuine than speech. Clara realized then that in this house, silence could mean belonging. The next morning, Clara stepped outside to the sound of steady hammering. Thomas was bent over the porch rail, driving nails with the patience of a man who wasted no motion. His coat hung from the railing, the scar above his brow catching the pale light. Clara hesitated, then quietly asked, "Can I help?" For a long moment he studied her face as if weighing her intent. Then without a word he handed her a nail. Together they worked side by side, the rhythm of hammer and wood, creating a language that needed no sentences. Her palms soon burned the skin soft from years of loss rather than labor, and by midday blisters had formed. Thomas noticed his voice low but edged with truth. "Not used to this kind of work." Clara met his gaze, her chin steady. "I've worked," she said, "just not for anyone who noticed." For the first time, a faint curve touched his mouth, something close to a smile. Clara felt the ache in her hands, but beneath it pulsed something new, the quiet power of finally being seen. That evening, the house carried the kind of quiet that was not empty, but waiting. Clara moved through the pantry, searching for what little she could use for supper. Her fingers brushed against an apron hanging on the wall cotton, worn thin, its edges softened by years of wood smoke. She froze. It was not hers to touch. With a small breath, she reached instead for a plain towel, letting the apron hang undisturbed, like a memory left whole. She cooked with care, though the stew was thin and oversalted. The twins devoured it with unguarded delight, and Thomas ate in silence. After the dishes were cleared, Clara lingered by the window, watching the snow cling to the branches outside like lace. The fire behind her threw its warmth across the room, yet what weighed heavier was the unspoken presence of someone who had once filled this place. Without turning, she asked softly, "Was your wife kind?" The words trembled as they left her, not from fear, but from reverence for a line she wasn't sure she should cross. The silence stretched deep as the winter night. Finally, Thomas answered with a single word, "Yes." No explanation, no story, just truth carried in the weight of his voice. Clara nodded, her gaze still fixed on the frosted glass. She had not asked more. He had not offered. And between them lay the fragile thread of respect for the woman who had come before, and for the space that grief had not yet finished guarding. That night, the stillness of the cabin was broken by the sharp cries of the twins. Clara rose at once, her heart racing, as she found them tangled in their quilts, trembling from nightmares too heavy for such small shoulders. Without hesitation, she gathered them both close. Josie pressed against her neck, June sobbing into her arm. She rocked them gently, whispering a tune, with no words, only a rhythm meant to soothe. In the doorway, Thomas stood helpless, his rough hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Clara looked up and murmured, "I'll stay with them." He gave a tight nod. The girls quieted their breaths, steadying until they fell asleep against her. Clara did not move. By dawn, she woke, still surrounded by their warmth, a fragile peace replacing the terror of the night. Morning came with the smell of firewood and the weight of decisions unspoken. Clara busied herself in the kitchen, mixing what little flour remained, her hands steadying as she kneaded the dough. The bread cracked at the top, baked unevenly, but when she set it on the table, the girls tore into it with glee. Honey dripped down their chins, laughter rising like sunlight through the cabin. Between giggles, June looked up, cheeks sticky. "Should we call you Mama?" The question hung heavy. Thomas glanced over, sharp and searching. Josie, with innocent certainty, whispered, "You smell like home." Clara's throat tightened, but she steadied her voice. "Maybe just Clara for now." The girls nodded, untroubled, and reached again for the bread. For the first time in years, Clara felt the taste of belonging warm her more than any fire. At the general store, Clara felt the sting of eyes before a single word was spoken. The bell above the door had barely stopped ringing when Mrs. Tibbet looked up, her lips curving into a smile sharp enough to cut. "Well," she said loudly so the room could hear, That was quick, wasn't it? Already keeping house for a man who won't even say your name? The air turned brittle. Clara froze, the sack of flour heavy in her hands. She glanced at Thomas, hoping for a word, a shield, anything. But he only turned back to the shelves, jaw tight, saying nothing. That silence cut deeper than Tibbet's venom. They rode home wordless. The wagon wheels creaked against the frozen ruts, each turn a reminder of what had not been said. That evening, Clara sat on the porch, firelight flickering behind her, the taste of shame still raw. Thomas stepped out, his shadow falling across the rail. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then his voice, low, gravel, rough. I didn't answer her. Clara stared ahead, silent. I should have. She turned to him, then meeting eyes darker than the night. I've been a name no one spoke before, she whispered. It matters. He didn't offer excuses, only a quiet nod. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first crack in his silence, a promise that next time she wouldn't stand alone against their judgment. The next morning, Thomas's actions spoke louder than any declaration. When Clara stepped into the children's room, she found a second cot carefully set beside the twins' bed. The blankets were folded neat, the wood frame steady, a clear gesture that she was not a guest passing through, but someone with a place under this roof. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was belonging. That afternoon, the girls tugged her excitedly toward the root cellar. To Clara, it was just a dugout hole lined with shelves of pickled beans and onions. But to the twins, it was treasure. Our secret cave, June whispered, holding a chip button like a jewel. Josie pressed it into Clara's palm, swearing it would keep away nightmares. In that dim, earthy space, Clara realized something unexpected. The girls were weaving her into their magic, their little world of treasures and talismans. Between the cot in the bedroom and the button in her apron pocket, she was no longer a visitor. She was being stitched into the fabric of the house, not by grand vows, but by small acts of trust that felt more binding than any ring. That evening, as the fire crackled low and the girls slept soundly in the next room, Clara sat quietly with a patch of fabric in her lap. Thomas's steady hands worked at a block of wood, his knife-shaping wings out of silence. At last, he set the carving down, a small bird wings, half spread, rough but strong, and placed it gently into Clara's hands. They need a woman who stays, he said, voice low, almost swallowed by the fire's hiss. They'll get hurt if I leave. Clara traced the grain of the wood, feeling the honesty in its weight. I don't want to be another ghost in their house, she whispered, thinking of the woman whose apron still hung by the pantry. You're not, Thomas answered simply. The moment stretched between them, fragile and steady all at once. Then, with a gesture so quiet it nearly undid her, he reached out and brushed a loose strand of hair back from her face. His fingers lingered for the briefest breath before falling away. Clara held the bird close, as though it had been waiting in his hands just to find hers. It wasn't finished, not polished, but neither was she. In that small token, part gift, part vow, she understood this was not a promise wrapped in words but in presence. In a man who spoke little yet found ways to say everything that mattered. As winter loosened its grip and the first signs of thaw appeared, the world seemed to soften, yet the thaw carried a different kind of chill. Grass pushed through patches of melting snow, chickens laid more often, and the sky shifted from gray to blue. But with the thaw came wagons' chatter and the return of voices that cut sharper than frost. Gossip seeped into every corner of town like water through cracked boards, and its target was Clara. Hanging laundry on the sagging line, Clara felt the weight of it. Shirts snapped in the wind like banners in a fight she had never chosen. Between gusts, she heard her name carried, not like it belonged, but as if it were being tested, doubted, judged. Children's laughter from the yard rose bright, yet it could not muffle the echo of Mrs. Tibbet's voice, sharp as vinegar. She's not even kin. What right has she to raise those girls? She burned down her own home, and now she's curling up inside someone else's. The sheriff, slow of backbone and quicker with pie, had only shrugged at the general store when pressed. Ain't no law against kindness, he'd said. But his hesitation, the way he wouldn't quite meet anyone's eyes, told another truth, that while the law had no claim, the court of whispers did. Mrs. Tibbet's reply cut deeper. There's a difference between kindness and keeping a man warm without a ring. Those words followed Clara long after the door shut behind her. They clung to her even as she carried the flour home, even as Thomas accepted the sack from her hands, without asking why she looked pale. She tried to shake them off while pinning his shirt on the line, but each movement felt heavy as though she were anchoring down a name others refused to let her keep. Inside, the girls were dragging sticks across the yard, their voices light with play, claiming they were building a castle. Clara turned toward the house, finding Thomas by the stove, bent over a boot sole, repairing what was worn with the same quiet steadiness he gave to everything. He looked up once, then back down. She crossed the room, hands restless, and the question pressed from her lips before she could stop it. "Do you think the town minds that I'm still here?" Thomas set the boot aside, his jaw tightening as if the leather in his hands had grown sharp. He didn't answer right away. "The town minds everything," he said at last. Her throat constricted. "I heard Mrs. Tibbet talking to the sheriff." "I know. She said I didn't belong." He looked at her, then the firelight drawing lines across his face. His voice was steady, but it carried weight. "Do you want to go?" The answer leapt from her chest before fear could shape it. "No." "Then stay." It should have been enough, his consent, his quiet loyalty. Yet Clara's heart pressed for more. Shelter wasn't dignity, and presence wasn't the same as belonging. She longed for something no one could strip with a whisper, not just a roof, but the right to stand beneath it without shame. The thaw had come, but in its wake lay a truth colder than snow: that warmth in this place had to be claimed as much as it was given. Evening draped itself over the cabin in shades of indigo and firelight. The twins were already asleep, their soft breaths tangled in the hush of quilts and dreams. Clara stepped outside the night air, crisp against her skin, and found Thomas by the barn lantern. He was oiling its hinges, moving with the same steady patience he gave to wood soil and silence. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the stillness. "The sheriff came today," she said. Thomas nodded once, not looking up. "They think I'm here for your comfort." The words carried both ache and defiance. Still, he didn't answer. He let the lantern hang between them, its glow swaying like an unspoken truth. Clara looked at the horizon, a thin blue line fading into dusk. "I need to know," she said, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the question, "What am I here?" At that, Thomas finally set the lantern down. He turned toward her, eyes dark as river stone, yet softened by something unnameable. "You make the girls laugh," he said, voice rough but even. "You keep the stove warm. You bring things back to life. But I'm not your wife." The admission left her lips like smoke rising from a dying fire. "No," his honesty was a stone dropped into still water. "And you don't intend to ask." Silence stretched long and taut. The only sound was the creak of the barn post in the wind. Then Thomas lifted his gaze steady as a vow not yet spoken. "Would you say yes?" he asked. "If I did?" The question startled her. For a moment, Clara forgot the cold, forgot the sting of gossip, forgot even the ache of years spent unseen. She blinked at him, breath caught, then managed a whisper. "Not yet." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't push, didn't plead. He only picked up the lantern again, turning the wick until its flame grew steady, casting light between them like a fragile bridge. "I'm still trying," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength, "to remember who I am when no one's watching. I can't lose that again. Not even for kindness. Not even for safety." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. "That's fair." He stepped back inside, leaving the door open behind him. Clara stood alone on the porch, the night pressing close, the lantern's glow lingering like a heartbeat. The chill wrapped around her shoulders, yet she did not shiver. Inside, she heard the low sigh of logs shifting in the hearth, the murmur of children's dreams, the subtle rhythm of a man moving about with unspoken care. She sat down on the steps, the wood cool beneath her, and let the silence settle. For the first time, she realized that asking for a name wasn't weakness. It was claiming the dignity she had been denied. And in Thomas's question, there was proof her place here would never be assumed. It would be chosen. The market air was thick with whispers, sharper than the wind that tugged at Clara's shawl. She carried her list carefully, flower needles, a jar of licorice drops for the girls. But she knew it wasn't the goods she was purchasing that weighed on her steps. It was the eyes, the judgment. At the counter, Mrs. Tibbet tapped her fingers on the worn wood. "Some say you're pretending," she said flatly. "Some say you're hoping for a wedding you won't get." Clara held her chin steady. "Some say a lot." The older woman's gaze narrowed. "Children need truth." Clara's reply came low but clear, firm, as a door shut against the storm. "Children need safety, and someone who doesn't leave when the talking starts." The store hushed around them. A boy bagging goods stared at the counter, pretending not to hear. Clara paid without flinching, gathered her parcels, and walked out the door, snapping closed behind her. For the first time, she did not carry silence like a burden, but like a banner. That evening back at the homestead, she found the twins in the barn, mud and chalk smeared across the side of a feed barrel, their laughter spilling like spring water. Josie had drawn stick figures, four of them, hand in hand. One wore wild hair, another stood tall in big boots, one had a scar marked on its head, and the last carried buttons where a heart should be. Clara touched the figure gently. "Who's this?" she asked. Josie's eyes shone. "That's you. We gave you buttons so you don't fall apart." Clara's throat tightened, not with shame, but with something stronger, steadier. She realized that no gossip could overwrite what the children had already claimed. She was part of the family they were drawing into, being stitched not by ink or law, but by love that refused to leave. That night, Clara sat by the fire, her voice quiet but certain. "I stood up for myself today," she said, "and for the first time I felt I belonged here more than I ever will anywhere else." Thomas looked up from his carving eyes steady on hers. "The girls painted you," he said simply. "They see what's true." Clara stepped closer, the flicker of firelight catching in her eyes. "Do you?" she asked. He set the knife down and met her gaze. "I see a woman who chooses. That counts more than anything whispered behind your back." Quiet words last longer. She smiled faintly, and he placed the half-carved bird into her hands, a wooden creature with one crooked wing, imperfect yet made to endure. It fit against her palm as though it had been waiting for her all along. In that small gesture, Clara understood neither of them was owned. They had chosen and were still choosing each other. The storm came sudden like an old grudge returned to settle scores. By noon the skies had turned to iron, and the wind clawed its shutters as if it meant to tear the house from its hinges. Snow fell heavy and wet, clinging to the earth in sheets. Chickens scattered across the yard, the twins ran with arms full of dolls and corn, and Thomas hauled buckets into the barn with his jaw set like stone. Inside, Clara gathered blankets from the line, her fingers raw, her hem soaked with icy slush. The cold bit sharp iron and pine, the kind that silences everything but memory. She turned toward the porch just as June burst through the door, panic in her breath. "Josie's gone," she cried. "She said she dropped her bird by the creek. She promised she'd be back before the snow stuck." Clara's blood froze faster than the storm. "Is she out there now?" Thomas stepped forward, lantern in hand, his face tightening, not panic, but something deeper, an unshakable dread. "I'll go," he said. But Clara was already pulling her shawl around her shoulders, eyes fierce. "She ran because she thought you'd be angry. She needs my voice, not yours." For a heartbeat, Thomas hesitated. Then he lit the lantern and pressed it into Clara's hand, his fingers brushing hers with quiet urgency. "By the split cedar," he said hoarsely. "That's where they play." The wind roared like a warning, but Clara went anyway. Snow slapped her cheeks, blurred the trees into faceless sentinels. Her boots slipped on mud beneath the fresh powder, but she kept the lantern high, its trembling glow a fragile defiance against the storm. "Josie," she cried, but the gale snatched the name away. She pressed forward every step, an anchor pulled through frozen earth until she reached the creek. Shallow, half-frozen, and cruelly still. Beneath the twisted cedar, she spotted a small, huddled figure behind a rock. Clara ran, heart battering her ribs. Josie sat there, knees hugged, tight cheeks, blotched red snow caught in her braid. Tears streaked her face. "I dropped it," she whispered. "The bird you gave me." I looked and looked. Clara dropped to her knees, scooping the girl into her arms. Her own tears burned hot against the freezing air. "Josie, you are worth more than any carving. Don't you ever think I'd trade you for a thing?" The child clung to her, trembling like a branch in floodwater. "I didn't want to lose what you touched," she murmured. Clara tightened her hold, rising with strength, pulled from somewhere deeper than exhaustion. "Then we'll make another," she said. "But I will never lose you." The trail had vanished, buried under the storm's hunger. Every step back was a battle against the wind, her body shield for the small girl she carried. Her legs burned, her fingers numb, but she pushed forward one step then another, whispering reassurance against Josie's hair. By the time they reached the house, Clara was soaked through breath, ragged body quaking. She didn't knock, the door flew open. Thomas stood there, lantern behind him, light carving his face into raw relief. He reached out and took Josie from Clara's arms, holding the girl like he'd been handed his own heart. His eyes flicked to Clara, wide in unguarded gratitude, too deep for words. June ran forward, her voice high and broken with joy. "You found her," Josie stirred in her father's arms, whispering. "She came for me. She always will." Thomas met Clara's gaze over the girl's head. He didn't speak, but his silence thundered louder than any vow. It was thanks, trust, and something like awe. Inside, the fire roared. Blankets wrapped. The storm thickened, walls rattling beneath its fists. Yet in that cabin there was warmth that no winter could claim, the warmth of a woman who chose to face the storm, and of a man who now knew he'd never face it alone. The storm had passed, leaving the cabin steeped in silence. Clara sat by the hearth, her shoulders aching, her dress drying in slow waves of heat. Thomas placed a mug of cider in her hands, its warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, Clara's voice broke, the quiet, low and raw. "When the fire took my home, it took everything. There's no headstone, no marker, not even a name carved in wood. Just ash. Silence. No one to say they lived, no one to say they were mine." Her gaze stayed fixed on the flames, as if afraid to meet his eyes. "I never got to bury anything. It was like my life was erased." Thomas leaned back, his rough hands still. His voice came quiet but steady, carrying more weight than volume. "You're here now. That's enough." She turned, startled by the simplicity of it. Enough. She had carried years of shame, of loss, too heavy to speak aloud. And here was a man saying her presence, her breath, her being was sufficient. Clara looked down at the mug cider, trembling just slightly in her grip. For the first time in years, she felt as though the world was not asking her to prove her worth. The warmth between them was wordless, but it filled the room like a vow. That night, Clara rose from her chair and crossed to the small bundle she had kept hidden beneath the cot since the fire. With slow, deliberate hands, she unwrapped the cloth and drew out the only relic of her former life, a wedding band warped by heat, blackened and bent from the blaze that had stolen husband, child, and home in a single night. For years it had sat buried, too heavy to throw away, too painful to look at. Now, standing before the hearth, she placed it gently on the mantel beside the box Thomas had shown her earlier. The firelight flickered across the twisted gold, turning it into nothing more than metal. "I was someone else once," she whispered, her voice steady, though her chest tightened. "But she died with the ashes." Thomas stood beside her, saying nothing. He did not reach for her or speak to soften the moment. His stillness was witness enough, giving her the space to let go. From the table behind them, Clara noticed a slip of paper resting half hidden under the girl's drawings. She picked it up and saw the shaky, childlike letters, Clara. The name was spelled unevenly, the lines crooked, the letters nearly tumbling off the page. Yet it was hers, written by small hands that wanted her to stay. Her old name burned and buried. Her new one offered and spoken by children who had chosen her. Clara pressed the paper against her heart, then set it back with care. For the first time since the fire, she felt no weight pulling her backward. The woman who had lived in ashes was gone. The one who stood here had been given a name worth keeping. The thaw had barely softened the ground when trouble arrived at the McCrae gate. Mud splattered as three riders reined in their horses, the leader sitting tall in his saddle. It was Hiram Blass, a man with a grudge older than the fence posts that marked the southern line of Thomas's land. He was the kind of neighbor who wore civility like a disguise, and today the mask slipped. Clara stood on the porch, brushing sawdust from a quilt she had shaken out to dry. The twins were inside, stringing buttons into bracelets, laughter spilling like fragile light against the heavy air. Hiram tipped his hat, his smile thin as a blade. "Afternoon, Clara," he said, his tone almost polite, almost poisonous. "You've got some nerve standing on a porch you don't own." Before Clara could answer, Thomas rounded the corner from the barn axe resting against his shoulder. He said nothing at first, only let the weight of his presence fill the yard. Hiram shifted in his saddle but pressed on. "Call this a courtesy visit," he drawled. "Town's been talking. A woman living here who isn't a wife. Children calling her Mama when she's got no blood to prove it. Not illegal, sure, but irregular. And irregular things make folks uneasy. Uneasy folks start making poor decisions." Clara felt the burn rise in her throat, not from fear, but from fury long smothered. "And what decision is it you're circling around to?" she asked evenly, stepping down from the porch, her boots sinking into thawed earth. Hiram's eyes flicked to her apron, her clean-mended boots, the posture of a woman who had stopped bowing to whispers. "Just asking if you'll be moving along soon," he said, his tone oily. "Don't want to see McCrae tied up in gossip or land disputes. Boundaries shift easy in spring. Judge might see the southern fence different if pressed." Thomas stepped closer, lowering the axe gently into a stump between them. His voice was gravel steady and dangerous. "You didn't come here about lines on a map, Hiram. You came because your pride can't stand a man finding peace where you never could." Blas's smile faltered. One of the men behind him cleared his throat, uneasy. Clara moved closer, still her hands trembling, only with the weight of truth ready to be spoken. "You think this house is less honest because I sweep its floor? Because I hold children when they wake from nightmares?" She pulled something from her apron pocket, a small heat-warped locket. She opened it and showed the faded portrait of the husband she had lost, the man who had died trying to save their child when the fire caught the roof. "This," she said, her voice ringing over the yard, "is all that survived of that life. Not a deed, not a name in a book, not land or title. Just this." Her eyes narrowed on Hiram. "And you think I'll crawl back into nothing just to keep your pride safe? I've knelt in mud to pull a child from a storm. I've scrubbed blood from this man's shirt with my own hands. I've taught 2 girls how to laugh again. That's more than ash and rumor, and it's worth more than whatever paper you think makes a family real." The other 2 riders looked away, shame flickering across their faces. The wind shifted, carrying Clara's words with it. Thomas stepped forward, then his shoulders squared, his eyes steel. "You can turn around now, Hiram." Blas's jaw tightened. "You threatening me, McCrae?" Thomas's voice was quiet, firm as a wall. "No, I'm standing between you and something I won't let you stain." The silence hung thick. Then Hiram spat into the dirt, wheeled his horse, and rode off with his men trailing behind, the threat not gone, but retreating. Clara's knees trembled, but not from fear. It was the release of years of fury finally given voice. She turned to Thomas, whose axe still lay in the stump, and whispered, "You didn't have to say anything." Thomas met her gaze unblinking. "Yes, I did." Inside, the twins peeked from the window, their wide eyes bright with trust. Clara stepped back onto the porch, the warped locket still warm in her hand. For the first time in years, she felt she had defended not only herself, but the fragile dignity of a life being built. And beside her stood a man who would stand guard not over her name, but over her worth. Clara sat at the table, folding and refolding the same towel as the fire hissed behind her. The storm of words from the town still echoed in her ears, but her heart had already made its choice. She lifted her gaze to Thomas and said, steady though soft, "They'll come again. They always will. But I'm not going." Her voice carried no defiance, only weary conviction. "When the fire took everything, it burned more than my home. It burned my name, the one thing that made me real in their eyes. Since then, I've been nothing but ash to them." She touched the warped band she still kept hidden in her satchel, a relic of the life lost. "But here I've been more than a widow with soot on her skirt. I've been needed. I've been seen." Thomas studied her, the set of his jaw easing as though recognizing a truth he already knew. Clara breathed deep, the weight of running falling away. For the first time since the flames, she was choosing to stay, not as a guest, not as a shadow, but as herself. Holmes rose from his chair and crossed the room, his steps steady, deliberate. From the peg by the hearth, he lifted the apron that had hung there for years, softened cotton edges frayed by wood smoke and time. He turned to Clara and held it out. His gaze was neither pleading nor ceremonial. It was simply honest. Clara's breath caught. She had laid her own relics on the table moments before: the warped wedding band, the smoke-stained certificate, the child's tiny spoon, all that survived the fire. Tokens of a life ended in ash. Now Thomas was offering her not a replacement for what she lost, but a thread into something shared, something still alive. "I don't want her place," she whispered, fingers brushing the cloth. "You've never tried to take it," he said quietly. "But this house needs someone who stays when it's hard." Clara closed her hand around the apron. Not a crown, not a chain, but a trust. Between the burned papers and the worn fabric, she felt her name begin to root again, this time in soil of her own choosing. Thomas's voice was low but certain as he met Clara's eyes. "The fire didn't end your life," he said. "It prepared you for here. The words landed with the weight of conviction, not comfort and anchor, in a world that had tried to scatter her. Clara looked down at the apron in her hands, its fabric worn soft by years of use. With a steady breath, she looped the ties around her waist and knotted them firm. It was not a symbol forced on her, but a choice she made, an act that declared she was no longer passing through. In that quiet moment, role and belonging settled like a hearth newly lit. At dawn, Clara stepped onto the porch with a broom in hand, sweeping away the remnants of storm and season. On the railing, she set down two carved birds, hers and Josie's, small tokens of loyalty and staying. The air was crisp, the snow thinning into rivulets that ran quietly toward the fields. June patted out a button clutched in her palm. "Pa says you'll stay," she whispered, then added with childlike certainty, "When a woman finds her name again, it doesn't belong to the town anymore." Clara's throat tightened, but she only smiled, brushing a stray curl from the girl's cheek. The road stretched empty, framed by thawing earth. Clara looked out at it no longer with dread, but with calm defiance. Somewhere deep inside, a voice answered the gossip and suspicion she'd endured. Let them talk. She had a name now, one chosen, and lived not given or judged.